Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Becoming Anchored podcast. So glad you're with us today. We've got a great episode and content that we're super excited and passionate about. Before we jump in, I'm Lauren Jackson, one of your hosts of this podcast. This is Laura Deneen, our other host. We work in a group private practice in Brentwood, Tennessee, just south of Nashville, where we specialize in eating disorder treatment, body image concerns, a lot of other presenting concerns, and ages through the lifespan. We adore what we do, and we've really loved getting to share in this space, this podcast space with you all. So they're excited about this episode today. Quick disclaimer before we do jump in and before Laura really kind of introduces what we're all about here. This episode is meant for informational purposes only. So this isn't your therapy. It's not meant to be your therapy. If you're finding that as you're listening and engaging with the content that you might benefit from therapy, we would highly encourage you to either reach out to us if you're local, and we'll see if maybe you're a good fit with one of our clinicians, or find somebody local to you who's licensed, who's a professional therapist.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, this has just been a joy. We had some technical difficulties this morning, but we made it through. Lauren's husband is a producer, so we called him, and he, of course, fixed it in 10 seconds. So we all have our gifts. But yeah, if you're new to the show, this is the Becoming Anchored podcast, and this has just been a true joy for us to not only share some of our lived experiences, but some of the things that we've learned over the years sitting with clients. And then recently we've had quite a few guests on the show, and it's just been a joy to get to know other providers in different areas of the country and different people that we look up to. So yeah, we're all about really just talking about the hard things in our own lives, some of the hard things that we see with clients. And then we also are here to talk about the joy that we experience as well, and some of the points of celebration that we get to witness in our clients and also in ourselves. So thank you for being here. Without further ado, we are going to talk to you all, or share some of our thoughts on this idea of the grief of waiting. Something that, Lauren and I talk quite frequently about in the practice. And, the longer that I practice, the more I think grief is a part of really every session. Lauren and I were just talking about this yesterday. One of my dear friends and colleagues just talks about all counseling being grief counseling. And that really resonates with me, because we are really kind of always grieving. And I hesitate to use the word always, but there is, whether it's like an unmet expectation, and we'll talk more about the stages of grief here in a few minutes. But, I think that a lot of therapy is grief work, and it is grief therapy. And so we really wanted to talk about grief specifically in the context of something that you might be waiting for. So we're super excited to dive in today.
Yeah. Yeah, Laura, I know you just said you hesitate to use the word always. I don't know. I know we try and not be like extreme in our thinking, or black and white, or all or nothing. And there is a part of me that I think we are kind of, in some ways, always grieving, even if it's just this simple idea of grieving the time that has passed. Yeah. Right. This morning, I had such sweet little cuddles with my son when he woke up. And there's a small, maybe sadness of, oh, those moments are over. And so I think when we can get good at even acknowledging maybe what feel like small or insignificant moments, I think we can just be better aware and attuned to our own emotional experience, and even maybe greater or bigger grief moments, or just emotional kind of awareness in general, because emotional awareness is such a huge part of the grief process. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the reason, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that, as we, practice, and as we have both done our own therapy, one of the kind of reasons that I'm hesitant to use that word, for those of you listening, Lauren knows this about me, but we try to get away from always and never, so that dichotomous thinking. But I agree with you in the sense that, yeah, there is always something that we are grieving when we're paying attention. And I resonate with that so deeply. Even my little girl, so she just turned 2, and she's at this really sweet stage. And part of me does miss the newborn stage, right? She's very active and she runs around and she's definitely a climber. And part of me does really long for the time when she would sleep on my chest. And so that's grief, right? And it might be different than other types of grief, but there is a sadness there of, oh, wow, I really loved that time and I won't ever get that back. So yeah, I agree with you. I think the always is absolutely an appropriate word in this context.
Sure.
So yeah, Lauren, can you talk us through, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the stages of grief, what the stages of grief are?
Yes. So these stages of grief, maybe if you're listening, you've heard of this idea or you've heard of them or you've talked through them, maybe in your own therapy. They've been around for a while. Laura, do you remember who coined them? Who is the person? Why can't I remember the name of her?
I cannot. Is it Linda Kubler-Ross? I know that she's done a lot of work.
Kubler-Ross. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. I was like, I know her name, but I couldn't remember. Anyways. Okay. So there are 5 stages of grief. And sometimes when we think of stages, we think of, okay, so this is like stage 1. I've got to go through stage 1, and then there's stage 2 and stage 3. And so the word stage can, there's all kinds of different thoughts on that. But there's an idea that there are different like emotional experiences that we go through that kind of encompass this like fuller picture of the grief experience. So stage 1 is denial. Stage 2 is anger. Stage 3 is bargaining. Stage 4 is depression. And stage 5 is acceptance. So there's this idea that when a grief experience really starts, we first, maybe typically, again, not always, not for everybody, but there's a general idea that we first are maybe in denial of the thing that is happening, maybe that we've lost or that hasn't come to fruition. We want to be there. And then as we move through this denial place of wanting to not believe that it's true or that it's happened, we then start experiencing anger about the thing that has happened. Anger that this thing or person or whatever has been taken from us, or that this thing hasn't happened the way we expected. And then from there, we can find ourselves bargaining. So trying to figure out a way to, I don't know, make it not be true. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
One of the pieces that I look for with bargaining, both in myself and in clients, is the if-then statement. That can be a key indicator that we are in the bargaining stage, right? So if I had done this, I wouldn't be going through this XYZ pain. If I had been more aware or whatever, right? Like whatever we tell ourselves to try to mitigate the pain. I think that's really indicative of like the bargaining stage of grief.
Yeah. And so in this stage or in this place of the grief kind of process, we can also find ourselves maybe even trying to take on a lot of the blame of what's happened in that if then kind of,
Absolutely.
Those statements that you're talking about. And then through the bargaining stage, then we find ourselves maybe in a, that's the word I think that the stage uses, but deep sadness, just that deep kind of emotional overwhelm of just the reality of what is being experienced. And then through that, we can maybe enter into the space of acceptance, of feeling, accepting of the thing that was lost or the person or the season or the whatever it is, right? So traditionally, there are those 5 stages of grief. At a point in my kind of training and whatnot with one of my clinical supervisors historically, she shared that there had been some, I don't know if I would call it research, or somebody had coined this idea that what if there's like this 6th stage, if you will? And I can't remember the name. I will need to go back and research it. But so there's this idea that even after acceptance, what if there's more that can be done or experienced in this grief process? And so someone, whoever it is, thought more about this idea of making meaning of our grief, or making meaning of the acceptance that we have kind of landed on with, again, whatever it is that we're grieving. And so I think that making meaning piece feels really important because it feels like not that it like ties a bow on it or not that it like provides this like perfect closure. But I think that when we do find meaning in what we're feeling, it can help us to experience more purpose
Absolutely.
and more hope. And we talk about hope. That's what this podcast is about, really, hope. And so I think the making meaning gives hope. And so that I remember when my supervisor was kind of talking through, I was like, oh, yeah, of course there's a sixth stage. That makes so much sense. There has to be meaning to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the stages.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Well, just explained. And yeah, we wanted to start there. If you aren't familiar with the stages of grief, definitely look them up. So Linda Kubler-Ross, I think is her name.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's since passed, but I know that David Kessler is a wonderful expert on grief as well. And I know that they collaborated closely together. And so if you're wanting more resources, I know that we follow him on Instagram. I've actually been to one of his trainings before and it was phenomenal. So that's just like a little side note, giving her credit for that phenomenal work around really teasing apart the stages of grief. And like Lauren said, when we think of a stage, we can almost think of, okay, I'm through this stage and I'm done. And I'm not going to ever feel the anger or the denial again. And I move on. So the interesting part about grief, just for some psychoeducation for you all, is that it can feel messy. And I don't say that as a criticism or a point of shame, but we can go through the stages and then find ourselves back in a place of anger. So the tricky part about grief is that it ebbs and flows and it can be messy. And, you know, it's not that we move through the one stage and then we're never in that stage again in the specific context of whatever we're grieving. And so it's almost like you imagine kind of drawing just, you know, a free-for-all kind of piece on a piece of paper and you have your crayon and you're just like drawing squiggly lines. I feel like that's a good representation of grief. I'm such a visual learner in person that helps me kind of understand grief. And so I will certainly have my clients do that intervention at different points in their treatment. But grief it can be hard because as humans, we want the comfort of, okay, well, I finished that stage of grief, and so I'm going to move on to the next stage. And our own expectations of ourselves and others can be tricky. Another piece about grief that's just coming to mind, Lauren, as you're talking, is how our society as a whole responds to not only their emotions about grief, but other people's emotions about grief. We as a culture, I think that we're trying to get better, but historically, we have not responded to grief well, in my opinion. Or, you know, when I hear other stories about different cultures, about the time that they spend laying someone that they love to rest and all of the different ceremonies that honor that person. So I think as a whole, it is quite difficult for us to allow ourselves to grieve, to acknowledge the grief. There's almost like a timeline. If we are grieving or if someone else in our lives is grieving something, it's okay, well, you should be done grieving by this point. So there's a lot of, I think, rules that accompany grief. And that can be one thing that, you know, specifically in the context of waiting can be quite difficult if someone is waiting for something. There's almost like adherence to this imposed rules that our society has developed. And so just a side note, right? Like doing our own emotional work of both for ourselves internally and externally in our environments, the people that we love. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, grief and sadness, because I think sadness is what grief is. I mean, right. There are a lot of other little things that go along with like people's individual grief experience, but sadness tends to be the thing, right? It is so painful. And pain, like we don't want to hurt, right? Like we don't want to be in pain. And so I think that's our tendency in avoiding, and then the tendency to try and work through something in my timeline. Well, I've gone through that stage. Now I need to be on to the next one. And then I also think that not that this is wrong or bad or whatnot, but, you know, there certainly are like different cultural like rituals and whatnot around grief and like communal grief. You take this many days off of work and I don't know, you know, that feel kind of ritualistic, yes. And I know that there can be a lot of value in ritual, but also I think that it can as well instill this sense of, okay, well, then if I've done this for this many days and then I've cried for this many hours and then I've taken this many days off of work, then I shouldn't be sad anymore. And I think that's where things can get sticky because that isn't fair, really.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
A super great service. And again, I so appreciate like the cultural piece of people's like rituals around how to grieve and how to grieve in that communal way. Because again, like you said, Laura, I don't know if we do that super well here.
Yeah,
like,
in the United States. Yeah.
American culture is like that communal kind of like shared experience of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that even in this idea of, you know, when someone's having a funeral and we're calling it a celebration of life, not that's wrong. We absolutely can call it that. And we can absolutely celebrate someone's life. And I think we're afraid of calling it a funeral because of how painful that is.
Oh my gosh.
And it's to be painful.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be sad. Right? And so anyways, that's a little bit of a side tangent because I know we're really talking about this waiting piece, but just wanted to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And, you know, I think too, as we're talking through this, like this is certainly, we are a part of the American culture. And so we're certainly not here to like just knock on other people. I think that we as a whole can do better and can always be growing and learning. But if you take anything away from this podcast, right, and we're like, okay, because if I'm listening to this podcast, I'm like, okay, well, tell me what the solution is, right? That's my Enneagram 3 that's showing up. And I think a lot of this work is, what are our expectations of both ourselves and other people in the grief process? Number one. And then number two, how do I respond to pain? So in both myself and other people, am I dismissive? Am I avoidant? Do I criticize myself when I'm in pain? And doing that work internally can be I think, a small part of changing the bigger culture at large. Yeah. So when we're talking about waiting, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started recording today, but when we're thinking about the concept of waiting, I mean, gosh, there are so many things that I know in my life that I have waited for, and I know that clients are waiting for. And there's that deep grief, I think, that accompanies the process of waiting and a deep longing of whatever said thing is that we're waiting for. I mean, a couple of things that come to mind for me, waiting for a partner. I have a couple of people in my life that really want to find their person and have wanted to for a while, and that's painful for them. And that's a grief-filled process. Waiting for a baby, right? I know that infertility is a really common struggle. Mm-hmm. Waiting for a job promotion, right? Or waiting to be seen in your work environment and to be acknowledged. Any other like common waiting kind of pieces that you see in your clinical work, Lauren?
One of the things that came to mind is waiting for healing, like maybe even physical healing, whether that's, I don't know, you know, you have a child who's sick or there's like a chronic illness or something like that, that I feel like that shows up a lot, you know, and then this, I guess it's just like kind of general idea of just waiting for the next season or like waiting for the next good thing to come. You know, I think sometimes we can find ourselves in periods of time where it feels like when it rains, it pours. It's like just one hard, bad, difficult thing after the other. And so just waiting for a break. And I feel like I can resonate with that at different points in my life. And so I know that is something that will show up in my office quite a bit. Yeah, those are two big things that come to mind.
And I think especially in the context of mental health, right? As clinicians, I hear that quite frequently, right? Like and a client might not use this language, but they are essentially grieving the waiting process, right? But I really don't want to have anxiety anymore, or I don't want to struggle with my body or my relationship to food or my OCD or whatever it might be. And what they're saying is, yeah, I do want the healing and the freedom that provides. And now we're not saying that healing means that you'll never struggle again. But essentially they're saying like, yeah, I want to move from surviving to living to thriving, right? Those
Right.
kind of three stages on a ladder, if you will, if you picture a ladder. And that can be so painful, especially in the realm of mental health, because our clients show up and they're doing the work. And I think just the pain associated with like, why is this not getting better? Or maybe they even have trouble seeing the better, in air quotations, right? If you're listening, of the different victories and areas of growth that they have experienced. But that's super painful, especially in the context of mental health. So I love that you brought up like the waiting for healing or waiting for some market improvement in their mental health symptoms, whatever they are. Yeah, waiting is painful. I think, the reason we wanted to kind of tie those two together is because, waiting is a grief-filled process, right? A lot of anger that shows up. There's a lot of discomfort that shows up. We were talking just before the show just about the uncertainty that accompanies waiting.
Yeah.
All of those things are essentially, another way to think about it is through the lens of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on just kind of how to, maybe some quick practical steps when people are waiting and moving through that grief process that you can think of today, Lauren?
Yeah, I would say that maybe first and foremost, if possible, when possible, and one of the things that we here at Anchored are training our clinicians on and assessing for in our clients in the first few sessions is support system. Are there people around you to help you do this? Because we can't, the clinician can't be the only person, right? That it's not going to be successful. It's not going to be maybe as productive of a therapeutic or recovery process, whatever that is for you. And so I would say that if whatever you're grieving right now, that you feel like you can identify, do you have people around you that you can lean on, that can be with you in your grief, that you feel safe to be unfiltered in your grief? So that feels significant. And maybe one of those first steps for you is seeking out therapeutic support. And then through that kind of therapeutic support, learning skills and ways to develop a healthy, support system outside of that therapeutic room. So that's like the first thing that comes to mind as we're thinking about like practical ways to be with her.
Yeah.
It's like you said, Laura, it's like we can talk about grief all day long and the emotions of it and even the history of the stages and all of that. But then it's, okay, great. What do I do with this?
What do I do with this? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, when it does come down to our emotional experiences, I tell my clients, we got to feel it. Like that is a productivity. Like that is work, right?
Yeah.
And that can feel so big and kind of ambiguous. And so having some more certain, if you will, steps or goals or, strategies makes this idea of sitting with our emotions, being with our emotions, feeling our emotions, letting them move, expressing them make a little bit more sense, I guess.
Yeah.
So maybe step one is, do I have people around me that I can do this with? Do I feel safe to do this with?
Yeah. And I mean, I think I didn't really understand this maybe when I first started as a therapist, the full gravity of this statement, but we talk a lot about having a witness to our pain. And that is what Lauren's talking about, right? That's the purpose of increasing our support, whether you get a therapist or go to a grief support group, right? We all benefit from having a witness to our pain and a witness that responds appropriately, right? So there can be people that are like, hey, just get over it, or like, why aren't you better by now, or whatever. And so that felt sense of like, in my body, okay, this person is with me, and this is how I know that they're with me. This is what it feels like when they're with me. And that's that witness piece. And that's circling full circle, right? That's the benefit of the communal grief that I think a lot of other cultures engage in so well, that we can learn from them. So yeah, I mean, that witness piece just feels really important. I think too, just acknowledging and taking a second to pause after you've listened to this podcast. Okay, am I waiting for something? And does that cause me an emotion? Might this be some maybe grief in my life that I haven't yet acknowledged or attuned to? Because you may not have even acknowledged, yeah, this is something I'm longing for. And maybe it is something that you've been longing for a long time or more recently, but whatever it is, I think just continuing to have that non-judgment approach when you do acknowledge, yeah, this has been hard for me. This might be some grief popping up in my life. And then that witness piece, that permission to feel. I think that the piece of paper with the like coloring without expectations can be a wonderful way to do that. There's lots of different like ways to kind of embody the grief, to feel the grief, whether you move your body in a way that feels healthy for you or whether you're drawing out and making some art to represent your grief. Maybe you engage in some kind of ceremony to acknowledge your grief, whatever it is. There's no right or wrong. It's really just identifying what you need and then doing that thing, waiting specifically.
Yeah, you can even, I mean, as we're talking about just some like exercises to engage in, if you will. Letter writing can be a really significant and helpful grief tool or whatever. So if it's more of I'm waiting for this thing and I'm really grieving that, maybe it's you give your sadness permission to write a letter to you, or you write a letter to your sadness, or if you maybe identifying like what stage you feel like you're in. So maybe you're in that bargaining stage and you just give yourself like some permission to like kind of free write just like all the different ways that like you're bargaining, just like kind of get them out of your head. Or so, I mean, you can get, you certainly can get creative with it. There are a couple, I mean, there's this one book that's coming to mind. I think it's called the Grief Recovery Handbook. And so that, because like you said, Laura, when we think about our grief, it's messy, it's overwhelming, it's big, and then that can cause a tendency to then avoid it. But if we can have something like maybe a book we're reading, or some like a workbook that we're kind of following along through, it can add a little bit more structure and maybe a little bit more certainty, or a little bit more like something tangible to like grasp onto that's helping gently kind of guide us through the things we're feeling. And so that book comes to mind. So it's a book, but then it has all kinds of exercises in it. So something like that you might find could also be helpful for you in your journey. There's this I've used this a lot in sessions with my clients. There's it's a picture book. It's like a kid's book, I guess, if you will, but it's called Tear Soup. I think that's what it's called. I think I have it in my office somewhere, but it's like this, Tear Soup. It's a picture book, but it's all about grief. And so anyways, that can be a really meaningful book to read through because it can be applied to any type of grief that you're in. So
that creative entry point, right? Where it's sometimes that more rational logic part of our brain. We got to find more entry points, if you will, to access the grief. And so, gosh, I might have to take a look at that book, or perhaps order a copy. Yeah. I mean, this is just, I think that we could continue talking about this, and maybe we'll do just a second episode on the pain of waiting, or more episodes on the topic of grief itself. I think that could be just a good topic for us to chat about moving forward. Thank you so much for just being here. This is an important topic.
It is. There's not a right or wrong way to grieve. And I think that, that feels uncomfortable to us because there's not a solution to grief, because that's not the point of grieving, is to find a solution or to fix anything.
Yeah.
The point of grieving is to feel in the presence of others. We heal in the presence of others. We heal in relationship. So it's big and complex, and we're here for the big and the complex.
Yeah. Your grief is not too much. I think a lot of our clients feel that they have to contain their grief or part of themselves. And I certainly have felt that way in my own life historically. And so it's permission to be Laura, my full embodied self. And same with you, Lauren. As we wrap, Lauren, do you want to provide an affirmation or our homework today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just say, what you just said, your grief isn't too big. Your emotions aren't too big. Your sadness isn't too big. Your anger is not too big. There are these different stages that we talked about. I think we can put like some negative and positive connotations on some of these different stages, right? Like maybe sadness being like, okay, it's more okay to be sad and it's less okay to be angry or to deny something. But when we're thinking about this, these stages or all of these different experiences are all very much so okay and not too much. And so grief in our bodies, sadness in our bodies can feel really big. And however that needs to be expressed can be expressed just as big.
Yeah, I love it. Well, we mentioned this earlier in the show today, but your homework is really to spend some intentional time acknowledging what you might be waiting for. And if that has caused you any grief, and permission to acknowledge that and be with that, resource yourself around that, right? So when I'm using that language resource, it's okay, what would be most helpful to me? Is it some of these interventions and tools that Lauren and Laura have talked about today, and really honoring whatever resource comes to mind? Thank you all for being here on the Becoming Anchored show. We will see you next time. Take care.
Bye, guys.